All right, let's go ahead and get rolling again. First of all, thank you both for staying for a few extra minutes with us. And I'm going to ask you just something that's really I'm curious about. And you guys have been remarkable leaders for many, many years. What is it that shaped you into becoming the overachievers that you are?
That's an interesting question. Well, I think it's people pushing me. For example, I was comfortably in a job in 1975 at the Indian Health Service. I was a GS-12. I was administering the health aid program, and I really loved that program. It's a great program, still around today. And then this opening came up at Siri to be president. I was involved in Native affairs all the way up until then. Of course, I was involved in the earlier set with Willie and those, and then CINA, and I'd been a member of CINA, still was at the time. Mm-hmm. And I said to Charlene one day, my wife, I said, why do I want to take the presidency of Siri? The board had come to me. There was a rump session on the board in May of 1975, and there was a lot of frustration on the Siri board that we had not yet achieved a land settlement. We had to go back and renegotiate a land settlement because the original settlement that passed, it prescribed things that could not happen in our region because the lands it described were already gone to the state and others. And so we had to make a new settlement. And at the time, that settlement had failed for the second time, and the board fired the president. And they said, we want you to take it. And this was like on a Friday night. It was Andy Johnson, yeah. And I said, geez, I got to go home and talk to my wife. So I went home and talked to Charlene, and she said, take it, it'll be good for you, it'll be good for them, you can do this. I said, well, you know, I'm still in college, I'm going to school at night, and I'm happy being a GS-12, we're making enough money, we've got weekends off, and I don't have a bunch of people scolding at me. And she said, take it. So that's all I heard from her, so I took it. So I took it, and I never looked back. It helped me, I think, realize and fulfill the potential I had that I, in fact, probably didn't know I had. And so that's how that one ended up. But before that, I'd always been curious about things. I read a lot, and I was curious about mainly scientific things, and I wanted to move up in my job, and I moved up quickly, very quickly, in fact. And I wanted to do other things. I was anxious to learn more. I guess it's a desire to learn more, to do things more handily, more intelligently. I was going to school at night, and my days were full. And what prodded me to do that? I guess it's just born that way with intellectual curiosity.
Yeah.
And I was very full of energy too. I think that helps. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you have excess energy that you can't shut your mind down too easily, and you're thinking about things, and you have ideas about things, and I suppose it's glandular, I don't know.
Testosterone.
So I really can't answer your question. What makes it happen? I think you.
Well, that must have been a leap of faith, I think, for you to go from a job that you were doing well and enjoyed to something that was completely unknown.
I had been on the board since the outset of the company in '70. It was an interim board for 2 years, and then in '72, the act authorized the for-profit corporations to begin forming. And so in June of '72, SERI was organized as a corporation, as required by the law. And the land effort had gone forward from even before that until the May of '75 when it collapsed. And so.
Thank you. So before you even sat at this table, Willie, you were a state senator and you had already done a number of things. What made you decide to take those kinds of...
Well, unlike Roy, I didn't have a job. I didn't have any skill. I was single. And I had a degree in the most useless academic area in the United States, political science. What the hell could a guy do with that, you know? But I made it work. And it's not, you know, I came from a generation in which, you know, if you got through the 8th grade, that was damn good. Because out there in the country, if you could add and subtract and read, what more did you need? Because your job was out there in the country, making a living. You know, so nobody in my family had ever been to school, except for a few years maybe. Because you know, the school was an all-me thing. It was a white man's thing, and they forced us to it. I mean, they sort of concentrated us, you know, into these communities. And up north, you know, we had to be scattered because of the nature of the environment. You know, you couldn't sustain large populations unless you were at a place called Wales or Point Oak, where you got tons and tons of protein, you know, from the whales and walrus, etc. So in our world, we were kind of scattered out, and then we had to get forced in because of the government and the missionaries combining, because they wanted to control us, right? And anyway, but I learned to read, though. You know, back then we weren't permitted to take anything home from school. I don't remember ever having homework or even bringing a book. We weren't allowed to bring books home. I guess they knew that if it could burn, we'd probably use it to light the fire. Yeah. Because we were, you know, you guys don't know what it's like. When I went to bed at night, when the morning came, everything was frozen inside the house. And we didn't have beds. In fact, in the sod houses I lived in, we didn't have a stick of furniture. We had no chairs. We had no beds. Our cupboards consisted of some Blazo boxes. We had a homemade stove for wood burning and a Coleman lamp or candles or seal oil sometimes when we ran out of kerosene or gasoline. So it's a different world. It was a hard, tough world. And, you know, we didn't blame anyone for it. It was our way of life, you know. I mean, it was a great life if you had your health. Because you're always out doing something interesting, moving, doing things, going by dog team, going by boat, hunting this, hunting that, picking that, doing stuff you know. And so it was an okay life, but I learned to read, and I guess like Roy, I got kind of curious because we couldn't even envision hardly anything outside of our own community. I mean, we heard of Seattle. That's where the North Star, the big ship, came from once a year. You know, that brought all the stuff.
BIA boat.
Yeah. And anyway, so I ended up kind of wanting to know what was out there, you know, and our reading matter mostly was comic books, you know. That was our entertainment, and, you know, people loved them. I mean, we traded them, collected them. God, if I had those comic books we used to have, they'd be worth $1 million, right? Anyways, it was a totally different world. And anyway, I ended up in Tennessee. One day I was in Kotzebue on a Nice summer day. Next thing, I was sweltering in the heat of Mississippi at 100 degrees and humid before being driven off to a boarding school in Tennessee. But I didn't have to go, and I still, when I look at the pictures of my mother and me at the airport, and my sister and other relatives, I keep wondering, Jesus, how in the hell did I have the nerve to get on that plane? I almost didn't. I didn't have to. I was interested enough to try it, and I think that was sort of characteristic of my future life. That is, I figured if just get out there and do it, you know. And anyway, but the truth is, I'm like a lot of us. I think I'm fortunate to have maintained a sense of my own identity. If I had not, I would have probably married a good, sweet Southern belle and never come back. Really. I mean, I went to school with some Cubans, boarding school, who ended up doing just that. I mean, this is just before the Cuban Revolution, you know, and unfortunately for them, they were probably part of the ruling elite with Batista, so they couldn't go back to communist Castro, Cuba, you know, so they got stuck in America. Married local gals and still living down there. I communicate with them. But I think what was important for me is that I basically had to make choices early on. And I did that even when I decided to go to school, boarding school. Mm-hmm. I was just at the stage where I could help my mother and family. I was a hunter. I mean, that's what we were taught to do, hunter and fisherman, you know. And I was just at the point where I could be of some help. And but she did let me go, and I often think about that and how she made that decision. You know. Anyway, I was gone for 4 years. I came home only once because we couldn't afford for me to go back and forth. But oddly enough, the day I was in Fairbanks on the way to Kotzebue, the Senate had just passed the Alaska Statehood Bill.
Huh.
59.
58.
58, that's right.
Summer of 58. And like a dumb shit, I celebrated. Everybody else was celebrating, right? I mean, it was like a parade and everything. And what I didn't realize, of course, was the germ of our destruction in there, right? The authority of the state to select over 100 million acres of our land. And I didn't know it at the time. And you know, people, I mean, I think I never looked at the numbers in terms of the vote for statehood. I just wonder how our villages voted. Of course, Southeast was sort of into the political arena, right? They had been because of William Paul and ANB, and they became a power down there. And, you know, the non-natives were pretty pissed that the doggone natives were getting involved in using power politics, you know, and William Paul was active and young. But, you know, Southeast did get some benefit. I mean, they got rid of, well, first of all, they got the ferry system. And number two, they got rid of the fish traps. I mean, essentially what was happening was the fish had become private property, right? Because of the fish traps. And so they'd catch all the fish that were coming up to spawn, and so the Indians lost their food sources. Every major stream from Southeast Alaska to my hometown had a cannery, you know, that was controlled by the Seattle fishing interests. I mean, that's sort of the nature of a colonial setup, because all they had to do was kind of get their deal done with the feds, right? They had their lobbyists and whatnot. And in that instance, the lobbyist was Arnold, a guy named, what's his first name? W.C. Arnold, William Arnold. Does anybody know this fact? I mean, if you don't know that history, you should, because William Arnold had a lot of power representing the canned salmon industry during the territorial days, and he could practically go this way or that way on any law, you know? And he was an opponent.
And even today, the mouths of every major river in the state are owned, the best land on the mouths are owned by the canneries. They had that land granted to them by the federal government under the primary place of manufacturing laws at the time.
Not only that, I love history. Anyway, the last house I bought over here in Huntington Park, after I got back from D.C., I was living on the hillside, but it was way too long a trip to to go see my little tutiks, my little grandchildren. They're all living here in town. 15, 20 minutes was too long for me, so we moved into town. Anyway, so when I bought this house from a guy named Renfro, downstairs there was a tenant. And Renfro had remodeled this house around his tenant. Well, when Abby and I were looking at the house, when we went downstairs, I was real quiet because the guy was over there in the corner, asleep. And there was a bathroom and a little kitchenette, and he had his own door. He's in a wheelchair. And what I didn't realize until that moment was that this guy, I knew him. He was an avid opponent of the land claims during the Hickel era. And his name escapes me at the moment. I'll think of it. And so, but when I was looking in the garage, there was these bookshelves of lots of law books. He was a lawyer. And in one section, I saw two books. One was Bob Arnold's book, the red one, the land claims book that
him and Lydia Hayes put
yeah,
together.
through the AFN Foundation when Emo was head of it. The only sort of the decent books about the history of native lands. Bob Arnold, he was a very good friend of mine. He's long gone now, but the other book was a binder with the name another Arnold, W.C. Arnold, and I knew immediately who that was and what it was. So I told Renfro, I said, tell, what's his name, that I will lighten his load, I'll buy these from him. Well, that's the last I heard till I went back to get the keys when I bought the house, and Renfro handed me those two items.
Wow.
The tenant had died.
We saw you and died.
Yeah. Anyway, I wish I could think of his name, but I just remember that he was an avid opponent of the native claims, and there was also some clippings in there. And W.C. Arnold, by the way, this was all the legal arguments against native claims. That was the Bible of Bob Atwood,
Wow.
the head of the Anchorage Times, and he'd run these scurrilous anti-native land claims articles, and of course the chambers of commerce were lapping it up because historically speaking the business people were always opposed to native interests and native lands, and at that point, even after having done that research paper, I didn't know that Bob Atwood in the 40s had written these extensive editorials against reservations because the 1936 law, the IRA, that the foundation of our tribes gave the secretary authority to create reservations, and they had begun to exercise that not on a major multi-million acre scale, but on small scales in the villages, a lot of them for ranger establishments and schools and that sort of thing. But even then, what I didn't know is Atwood was railing against native claims, and this went on all the way right to the day that we started fighting for our land claims, and it was the most powerful, influential paper. And the business types kind of lapped it up, and they were enemies of ours. The business types were enemies of ours because they thought we were going to get something that they should have because they were going to get rich, right? That's the economic interest is always very key.
In fact, Atwood already had interest in the oil field, the Swanson oil field.
Yeah.
Him and several other businessmen,
Yeah,
and they were,
that's right.
I think, afraid that something. Subsequent to that, though, Atwood could see that the Claims Settlement Act was working in an economic way that was good for the state. And he invited me one day when I was president of CIRI. He says, Roy, I want you to come out and see me and help me change my mind. I want to know why I should change my mind.
Well, Shethead never called me.
You were always up in talks with me. He could reach me.
Well, I do have an incident, though. I actually organized the bank, which unfortunately went down with about a dozen others during the
Well, I
last
was just going to
recession.
finish by saying, for about 2 years, I wrote articles, monthly articles in the Anchorage Times that would help change how people felt about the settlement. I wasn't an apologist for anybody, but I was just saying this is a good thing for us. It should be a good thing for you too. You know, in so many words. Anyway, that's how it ended.
Well, Atwood was a big kahuna in the press and influence-wise, but the son of a bitch never ever saw the rest of Alaska. I mean, he was just right here. What he could see from 4th Avenue is about all he knew about Alaska. You know, at least Elmer Rasmussen, bless his
He's the only one.
Presbyterian soul. I think he's Presbyterian. Yeah. I mean, you know, well, so he sort of represents that missionary spirit that, you know, after they had put the Indians in these reservation prisons, you know, it became like a hunting ground for the churches, right, to go get some souls. And so they went on these reservations. They were really battling like crazy, trying to get souls. I mean, they're using up a lot of energy. And then a few of those, like Sheldon Jackson, and them, that's where they cut their teeth, right? And the government was more than happy to turn the Indians over to the American Missionary Association because they didn't want to spend any money if they, you know. And besides that, if you got converted to Christianity, you're going to be okay. You're going to be a good American, right? Anyway, so that's the Rasmussen sort of legacy. They came up to Yakutat as missionaries, but at least Rasmussen, he was running for senator in '68, I think it was, and he had a big interest in history. He did a whole series of television programs on history.
I'll be right.
Yeah, that he used to try to get his name across, to, you know, because he knew he was going to run for. It was a service, but he was also self-service too, because he was going to run for senator. And I gave him a copy of my paper. He asked for it, my land claims paper, and so he read it, and I think he was more open to the notion of a settlement than his brother-in-law Bob Atwood ever was. You know, because I think he could see the potential economic benefits. Because you have to remember that Alaska was starved. They were starved for any kind of capital spending. I mean, I could show you a letter where Wally Hickel actually invited the United States government to come up to Alaska to bomb it with nuclear bombs, to use it as a testing ground, just to get new capital up here, for God's sake. I mean, that's how desperate the pioneer types were for spending, right?
Yep.
You know. Anyway, so I think, you know, back then they looked at somebody like myself or Byron as militants. You know, in reality, what was militant was just the idea, right, that we could and should own land.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that. And you know, Byron talked about dress. I mean, it is. I think his observation about suits, you know, is I think on the correct side. I mean, it's part of the getup of power and success, right? I mean, you know, if somebody has a fancy suit on with cufflinks and whatnot, and if you have money to invest, I mean, you're going to invest it with somebody who looks like they know how to handle it, right? And in a way, I think psychologically, without really knowing it, I think we were trying to give a little bit of comfort to people who opposed us, if we looked a little bit like them, you know. And also the fact that we were going after, it turns out we're ending up with some big bucks, right? And so we sort of thought maybe the congressmen and senators, if we look sort of like them and talk like them, that maybe there'd be a better chance that we'd get what we're after, right?
Yeah.
And so now that I'm done with I was a corporate type too. In fact, you guys may not, I'm sure you don't remember that sometimes natives in general would kind of classify us as either corporate natives or tribal natives, right? And so when Willie Kasayuli and I were co-chairs of AFN
Uh-huh.
I was corporate Willie, he was tribal Willie, right? But of course, later on, Willie became part of the village corporation, right? But generally speaking, I've always been supportive of the notion of tribes, because that's how Congress is accustomed to dealing with tribes, right? It's part of the sort of the lay of the land.
You remember that guy that wrote the big story on Alaska, the environmentalist guy? In one passage of his book, what's his name? Coming into the Country.
John McPhee, my brother.
Yeah. Anyway, in one passage, he called Willie and I, and who else? Brooks Brothers natives. Remember that? Brooks Brothers natives.
You always had more fancy suits than I did.
Anyway, another Willie story. He was in the Senate, the state Senate at the time, and he was working hard on ANCSA and amendments to ANCSA, and he was also on the budget committee of the state Senate. And his good friend Al Adams was there. He was the chairman of the budget committee. And together they had to make up the budget for the state, and they had to, try to please everybody or please nobody or please themselves mostly, I guess. And so they were working on it, and the table was kind of like this, and the senators were all gathered around. And Willie, Al came over to Willie and began whispering in his ear.
Leaning across the table.
He's leaning across. Nobody could hear what he was saying. And suspicion went right through the room. What was the chairman saying to Willie Hensley? What was he saying to you?
He said, "Do you have any muktak?"
In your freezer, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it was actually that was a fascinating period, because I mean, somebody asked about your experiences and why you did this, that, and that, but at one time I was both president of NANA and a state senator on the finance committee. I was working my ass off 24 hours a day down there. When Senator Ferguson couldn't serve anymore, my colleague from Kotzebue, he had a stroke, and Governor Cooper appointed me to fill his unexpired term. And all of a sudden, boom, I was on the conference committee. There's three people each from the Senate and the House. And so of course, all the lobbyists are just in there. And on top of that, on the conference committee was myself, John Binkley, and Don Bennett from Fairbanks. Don was, we had a entire caucus of 20 senators basically in the same caucus. We did not have a Democrat or Republican caucus. It was one caucus, even though I was a Democrat. And I was in the ruling power group with Jan Fakes. She was president of the Senate. And Don Bennett was from Fairbanks, and he was very leery. He was very leery because Binkley and I were real tight, right? Until we had 2 votes out of 3, right? In any case, and of course Al was from Kotzebue. In fact, our grandparents were married, right? My grandfather, his second marriage was to his grandmother, Atomarach, or Maggie Adams, and they had one child together. So Al and I shared an aunt. That's how small this world is, but it was great fun.
In those days, the Bush caucus was very powerful because they had powerful people on that Bush caucus. You had Frank Ferguson, who is dead now. You had Al Adams, who is also gone. You had Willie. You had John Sackett. You had several other powerful legislators Nels Anderson from the rural area. And they could get things done for rural Alaska. And now it's not so easy, but yeah.
The key, I think, when I look back, I mean, the key is that, you could make a huge difference working with other people if you know who you are and where you want to go, right? And I think that's sort of why we Alaska Natives made a difference in Washington, because we might have had long historical rivalries, different cultural groups, but when it came to the land, that was, I mean, who can argue about the fact that we wanted land? I mean, it was something that we could focus our energy on, right? Even though it came out kind of oddball in terms of the corporation setup, but still, in reality, when you look back at it, maybe we did the right thing, because, under the old system, you could always blame Uncle Sam for every screw-up that happened, right? because they're the trustee. Whatever happened on your land, you had to go through Uncle Sam. You know, and so you, but in the way we set it up, hell, if we screw up, it's our fault, you know, and it's in our hands. And I think there was something underlying there that we didn't want some bureaucrat, you know, down there in Juneau or DC deciding what the hell to do.
And the act wasn't perfect when it was set up. It was far from perfect. But it's important to recall that it was amended many times. And it was amended at our behest, mostly. And we got a sensitive reception there because we always told Congress, now this applies to you in the future too, this is the settlement you made with us, you wrote this thing. We are going by it, and all we want to do is make it work better so that your act that you wrote for us will work better. And that argument always played well with especially our legislature. And we're Alaskan, you know, and so Ted was always there, Stevens, and whenever we needed anything after that, after the initial act passed, and I think now it's pretty much that way, but not maybe as avid as it was in those days. You had Gravel, you had Stevens, you had Murkowski after Gravel, but no, it always worked well. We always put it back on them and said, this is an act you wrote for us. We're only trying to make it work better, and you need to help us do that. And so we got amendments we needed pretty readily, pretty handily.
You did a bunch of amendments.
Yeah.
For us.
Yeah.
Okay. We could be dead tomorrow, so if you have a burning question, ask it.
I wanted to go off of what you just said. One of the things Byron really emphasized was how much that ANCSA is a living document and that there's amendments still coming. So I wondered what you recommend as what needs to still be amended. What should the future changes look like?
Well, what still needs to be amended, and it's not a really big amendment, but what you need to do is probably get some legislative blessing on how to handle the increasing role of the Claim Settlement Act corporations. Some of them have opened their roles to people that were born after the settlement, and others, and now we're getting like a quarter share, an eighth of a share, and you really need to look at any legislative blessing you might need to change the way the stock is issued. Right now, it's issued 100 shares per person, and there's just so many shares available under ANCSA, no matter how many people eventually are enrolled. And so you may have to go to stock splits or something like that. That's one area. It's not a big deal, I don't think. Is it working better? Through the amendments, I think you all know now that some of these corporations have gross incomes of more than $1 billion a year. So some of them are working pretty darn good. Arctic Slope, I see, is getting into oil, and they'll be doing even better. They've got a lot of great investments now. They make several billion a year in gross income. And others are doing the same. They're doing a lot of these government 8A jobs, and if you add up the gross income of these corporations, it's several billion a year. So that's not peanuts, you know. But what you need in the future going forward, as Willie says, it's up to us. You guys need to get good business educations, get on those boards, and you know, and make sure that you're a world-class investor, you know, because you are right now. Some of these corporations have interests all over the world. And is that success? I don't know. I think it is, you know, for the corporate model. I remember, as Willie said, when the act was first passing, some of the businessmen in Anchorage would say, we shouldn't worry so much about it because in just a few years that land will be ours. These guys are Indians. They don't know what the heck they're doing. They won't succeed, and we'll succeed to this land they're bringing into the state. Don't worry. We'll not worry about it. That was remember that was the guy that owned those hotels,
Yeah.
Kendall.
Yeah.
I heard him say that.
Yeah, Bruce Kendall, yeah.
But anyway, that was a common attitude of some of the businessmen around town. Don't worry about it. They're going to fail. They're not going to do this. But what's amazing about the Settlement Act is we didn't fail. There was a few Chapter 11s, but we didn't fail. We're still here, and we're still growing. And you guys are going to be involved, if you aren't already.
Okay, you all came up with questions.
I have another notion.
Huh?
Who was it? You asked the question? Well, to me, there were some gigantic failures in the sense of not being able to get things into the act that we wanted. But you know, as a minority, you got your hand out, right? I mean, you don't control the process, and especially when it comes to Native people. Once the door shuts, they're in there cutting the deal, and you're outside just hoping for the best after you do your best to get the provisions in that you think are consequential. But as I mentioned earlier, you know, a sovereign government is only interested in having one people, right? So, in my mind, the best thing that ever happened to us is the fact that Russia sold us to the United States. Because if we were a part of Russia, we'd all be Russians with nothing. You know, you have a group of white Europeans who galloped across Siberia with their blunderbusses and took control. And if you're out there with 100,000 head of reindeer, you know, your ownership in that land is about as deep as the reindeer could chew. The rest of it belongs to Putin, you know, the Tsar. Right? So you have nothing, nothing special. At least in this country, and I used to not be so generous because I was angry like Byron. I'm not as pissed off as he is still, but but you know, I was angry because I was ignorant. You know, I'm ignorant about how colonial powers take control and why and how human perceptions and whatnot are formed. That doesn't excuse the fact, though, that there's been a lot of harm done to us. You know, both by government and by institutions who believed that we were savage, barbarian, unchristian types to whom you can do anything. I mean, that started, you know, with Columbus. I mean, I used to wonder why there were priests who came along with them as the Spanish were lopping off heads, raping and pillaging and turning people into slaves. How could that happen? Well, it could happen because the religious powers said that we were savages and heathen, and you could do anything. You know? And you can, well, threaten, kill, whatever it takes to convert them, right? So that's a part of the history of human history that of course is kind of nasty, but a reality. And over the course of time, I began to understand it wasn't the fault of white people necessarily. It happens and has happened all over the world, and it all has to do with power and control. And I saw this in Bolivia at an ancient site there called Tiwanaku, where some great leader thousands of years ago had this giant statue and probably lorded over several countries of people at the time. But here was his symbol of state power and religious power, right? All wrapped in one, which is not unlike what has happened in Europe, of course, where the king or the queen is both head of state and head of church, right? Because that's what it takes to control people, right? And so, and I harp on that because I think we have not, in the native world, have come to grips with that concept, and how some of the church people were some of the first ones to begin to teach us how awful we were, that nothing about our cultures was okay. Our names were not okay. Our religion was not okay. Our names were not okay. Our music and dance were not okay. Our key ceremonies that held our community together were not okay. And to me that was an unchristian thing to do. And we have not unbound ourselves from that legacy to this day.
Kind of following up on that, do you think that going forward is something like similar like they did in Canada with the Patriation Act, I think it was, where they publicly acknowledged the harm that was done? And
Totally.
do you think that is something that
Oh, absolutely.
we should demand?
Totally,
or-
totally. In fact, I flew all night to get here almost. I got here from Reno, where the National Indian Education Association was meeting. And there was a little breakout session on that very subject. And I didn't realize that there is a national organization that was just recently formed, which I will give you the name of right now. But it's a very relevant question. It's called, what the hell did I do with it? Oh, there it is. Yeah, here it is. Marilyn DeCoteau, President, National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. Isn't that something? I mean, and then Christine Dean-DC McCleave, Executive Director, National Native American Boarding School Hearing. So they have a president and a executive director. And I think, in my course, I've had this section on the history of the American Indian boarding school system. And I've seen people my age virtually breaking down in tears, talking about their own experience in Wrangell and other mission schools where they were mercilessly beaten, for all kinds of infractions that they have never gotten out of their system. They never talked to their children or grandchildren about what took place. And even those who saw it as a positive experience oftentimes forgot how awful it was that for their parents to have let them go, and how for years they could not speak their language when they come back. They couldn't communicate anymore with their own family. And so in my mind, we Americans created that system that Canada used. And yet they've gone and done this national reconciliation, actually paid money for the damage they did to individuals, stealing them, hauling them away hundreds and hundreds of miles.
But you know what?
Yeah.
The Canadians never returned an acre of land to the Aboriginal people there. They still have never done a land claim. They created a borough or a big section of government up there, but it's for everybody, native and non-native alike. But that's Canada. They just have not done that.
They have some settlements, but it's slow.
Yeah.
Going back to your question about what do you change? Well, nothing is actually cast in stone, and I've worried for many years now about the potential loss of our corporations and lands, because in reality it is an ordinary business corporation organized under state law. Now it happens to be native owned, right? They happen to be native. So anything can happen politically. So you have to be alert, and you have to be smart about how you go about doing things and operating in a certain political environment. And so, to me, the challenge, and I've been like a broken record on this notion of cultural spirit, and I made my first significant speech ever to the AFN convention in 1981, which nobody remembers. But it was about the notion of how do we indigenize an alien entity like a corporation to make it serve us. Because in the end, I think Congress is smart. They're not interested in Indians being Indian. In a sense, you could look at this as a terminationist kind of setup, because if you're just focused on the bottom line, you're going to forget about language and culture, and cultural knowledge, and values, because you're busy trying to make the bottom line. But in my mind, that is a recipe for eventual loss of our lands, because down the road, 50 or 100 years, if your shareholders are completely disconnected culturally, at some point in time they're going to say, let's sell. But think Am I saying that it's bad? Well, not necessarily. Because we were about to lose it anyway, and we've had 100 years of trying to make it work, right? And so if those shareholders decide they're ordinary Americans, they're going to sell, and we're going to lose that land that sustained our people. In my mind, and from the beginning, it was all about the maintenance of cultural spirit and identity, right? And so I'm coming around to, what do you do to improve it? Well, the way I look at it, it's your generation, your job. If you're a native, I mean, you're living the dream that we hoped for you. That you have opportunity, that you'd have a better life, that you didn't have to freeze to death like we did, or starve, or have to work like a dog every day. I thought that, well, the big failure was, of course, we didn't have subsistence in the original bill, right? That was a major failure. We kind of fixed it up, sort of, with ANELP, with a rural preference. But to me, your job is to figure out how to deal with this issue of tribes and the corporation. And to me, that should not be insoluble. Tribes are important because a tribe is a government, and it has a broad mandate, including the continuity of the tribe as a special part of the human race, right? To me, a shareholder is like, a corporation is a zero, it's an empty thing. A shareholder is just a money thing, right? But I would say I have my youngest daughter's a lawyer, Lizzie. So you guys' job is to figure out how to make this thing work. I mean, we've got too many entities. Like in Indian country, the tribe is everything, right? They control the whole ball of wax. I mean, if there's a new chief, I mean, he can fire everybody, right? And put his people in there. But I would say that figure out a way to make the most of both. And in fact, when I was down at, is it Igiagi? They have the corporation office right here, and there's a curtain there, and there's the tribe, right? And they work together. I mean, it's a small village, so some of them, they wear 2 hats, or maybe 3 or 4. And so why can't we make it work, for those who want it to work?
And actually, that has been being redefined as we go forward. The settlement architects in Congress did not want to talk about tribes. But as we went forward, and Itak, had that piece of legislation in his pocket put away, it became clear that the executive branch needed to identify tribes. They still existed. And Secretary Ada Deer recognized 228 tribes in Alaska in the 1990s. And so the court cases have been redefining in favor of tribes. And really the only thing left is the justice system. It's not quite yet defined properly, but they're working on it. I see Governor Walker is talking about working cooperatively, combining the efforts of the state justice system and the rural justice system. So it seems to me that's a huge step. Once the village tribes get formally recognized as being a dispenser of justice, then you could start getting, and even now they're getting grants from the U.S. Department of Justice under the Indian legislation. So it's being redefined. It reminds me of something that my old friend Itak said at the time the Settlement Act passed. He said, now the Eskimo has a brand new harpoon. And he elaborated by saying we have a toolbox here. It's a toolbox. It's going to do a lot of things the old toolbox didn't do, but look at it as a toolbox. And you can make a lot of things out of that. Willie just touched on the things that we did. We created all the nonprofits as for-profit corporations to do the nonprofit things they do. and they work off of grants from the federal and state government, who would have to spend that money anyway. And why not spend it through contracts with a nonprofit? So we have really expanded in a lot different way than maybe the original architects, Wayne Aspinall and Henry Jackson, contemplated back in Congress. So there's work to be done ahead. The other issue that remains, of course, and it was decided in the what's the name of the reservation? Up north, the Venati legislation that disallowed, the Supreme Court of the U.S. disallowed taxation powers for Alaska Native tribes. But that doesn't mean that can't be changed at some point in the future. But right now, that's kind of, it's hit a stone wall right now. Anyway, there's a lot of things that have been done very innovatively, and it takes, you guys have good minds. You can continue to work on it as you go forward and use it as a toolbox. Think about ETUC. Now you got a brand new harpoon. You can do a lot of things with it, you know.
Yeah, I'm not sure we need all those entities out there. I mean, if we had the region corporation and a regional tribe, you know, I mean, these IRAs, you know, I mean, sometimes they're offered out there like some holy entity, but the reality is that the IRAs were some white man's idea about how Indians ought to be organized, right? A one-size-fits-all thing, just like the Lane Claim settlement was a one-size-fits-all deal. I didn't know nothing about this part of the country. I didn't know nothing about the Tlinkits. I mean, I knew about our world. And so if we had had a chance to negotiate a deal that fit our situation, that's what we'd have preferred. But there was no way that was going to happen.
If you could fit those services into a tribe, fine, but you couldn't in those days. You had to use the state nonprofit system.
Yeah. Well,
And so that's temporary, I think, and it can later be combined.
Well, we grabbed it because the way things were set up, you had the native village of, we would never call our tribe the native village of Kotzebue. To me, those teachers out there back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, they were like the government agent, right? I mean, and in earlier times, they were both the church and the state. They were the missionary and the teacher because Sheldon Jackson contracted with them. And so they had the job, I think. Somebody must have sat in Washington, D.C. and mimeographed all this stuff. It says, native village of, native village of, native village of. And they said the teacher's job was to set it up, right? And so to me, there's nothing holy about that thing, right? But you know, once you set up something, it's hard to kill it, right? Whether it's a corporation or a little government. But in my mind, you know, when Stevens was in power, he was kind of distressed about the 200 tribes we had. And if I'd had my way, our region should have taken a look at the idea of forming a single tribe, kind of like the Navajo tribe, you know, that covers lots of space. Instead of having all these little administrative units, you have more clout if you got a bigger entity, right? I mean, we merged 10 villages into Nana so we could have a bigger amount of capital to work with, right? And then we gave lots of power to the villages in terms of the board. But do we have to have a separate school district? Do we have to have a separate housing authority? Do we have to have a separate, whatever, you name it? Why not simplify it? I mean, after all, it costs money to run something, right? And so we'd have liked to have combined our villages into a single tribe, then go to Stevens with a budget saying, okay, this is what we wanted to do. Now that we've done what you liked, we simplified it, and here's all the things that we need done.
This argument's not new. It was at the outset of the negotiations that these guys were doing, there was thought of as one single corporation for the state. Remember that, Willie?
Yes,
Yeah,
Alaska Native Development Corporation,
yeah. And that would be it. It would own all the subsurface resources in one corporation, and the villages would own the rest of the surface entitlement. And that eventually died on the vine. But that's always come up. It came up when we were reorganizing the Alaska Native medical system. When we dealt with the, we tried to get everybody together, but each village wanted their share of that budget. Give us the share of the budget. Don't worry about statewide services. If we feel like we need them, we'll create them. Well, it's not gonna work that way. It wouldn't have worked that way. And so now you have what you have, and I think it's a pretty functioning system. But it's the same argument that we had back then when the Settlement Act was passed.
Hi, my question is about, in Alaska, we have a large problem with alcohol and drugs, and I realize that part of that is what Roy was talking about with the justice system, where we take somebody who does something, like in a village from Kotzebue, we bring them to Anchorage, we incarcerate them, and then when we release them, we say, all right, but you have to stay in Anchorage. They don't know anybody, they don't know what to do, they don't have a trade, and then they're not allowed to own firearms and live their life, so, you know, they turn to drugs and alcohol sometimes, and I was wondering, are there any solutions that you guys can think of? Maybe there's some way that some villages are taking care of something outside of reforming the justice system. I think we've all experienced.
Well, I think that's part of reforming the justice system, and the idea is that if you can handle it locally, that's the best place to handle it. But now, many villages don't have the capacity to do that, and they're not sanctioned by the state to do that. And that's the problem, but I think Walker's working on it, so I think that'll come to heel after a bit, as long as he stays in office and doesn't get impeached, Willie.
I don't know, it's a tough problem. I mean, it's not a new problem. I mean, I've been reading a book about the bear.
It's grossly unfair, though, I agree.
I've been reading about, anybody know what the bear was? Jesus, don't you guys read history? No, actually, there was a vessel called the Bear, and also called the Corwin. And the Bear was a vessel that was built in Scotland to do sealing in Newfoundland. You know, where they used to go with these clubs and hit these pretty little things with big eyes.
Seals.
Yeah, it just so happens that tens of thousands of seals are sitting there on top of the ice at a certain time of the year, and that was a money-making
Slaughter of the innocent.
yes. And so this vessel, that's what it was built for. But then it went on a mission to far north of Canada to some Americans who had been lost up there. But eventually it got shipped up to Alaska. It was really the only law, so to speak, of the United States in western and northern Alaska, starting in the 1880s for like 30 some odd years. And one of the most notorious captains was a guy named Michael Healy, Roaring Mike Healy. As it turns out, he really was private property, in the sense that he was an offspring of an Irish landowner in Louisiana, and one of his slaves. But they were light. I mean, he and his brothers. And using the income from the slave plantation, Healy's father sent them to the best schools in the country. One of them became head of a church, one of them became head of a university. And Healy got sent to London, but he wasn't into the academic world, so he went into ships and ended up being head of, for quite a number of years, the law in western and northern Alaska. And of course, one of his duties was to try to prevent the sale of alcohol, you know, which was a key part of the whaling revenue. As the 30,000 whales that existed in the Bering Sea began to diminish, which always happens. It happened with the sea otter. That's why the Russians left, right? You know. Anyway, so they had to make a profit. Every trip they had to make a profit. So, as the price of oil declined, baleen was still high, but they started killing walrus by the tens of thousands and selling alcohol, which is a great big profit item you know, in order to make a profit on those trips. And so ever since then, we've had, you know, substance abuse issues going way back. In fact, there was a mass starvation out in St. Lawrence Island in 1880-81 because they were drinking too much, and by the time they sobered up, it was a bad hunting year. They had sold a lot of their gear, you know, and people starved because they didn't have food, in part because of alcohol. So it's an old issue, but still a present one. And you know, people think that we got this great generous settlement. The reality is it's an absolute pittance, total pittance in the context of Prudhoe Bay and all the resources, right? I mean, if we had revenues from Prudhoe Bay, you know, the state has gotten like, what, $200 billion out of there already? God knows how many billions the feds have got, how many billions the oil companies have got, how many billions the contractors have got. I mean, shit, if we had the resources that were on our lands, shit, we'd be like Saudi Arabia. We'd have all the resources to put into these kinds of social issues. But the reality is we don't have now those resources. It's going to get worse, you know?
You know that they asked for, Emil and you guys asked for a 2% override of Prudhoe Bay in perpetuity.
Yeah.
But they got negotiated down to 2% of the override until 500 million is accumulated, and that would be paid by the state. That's how it worked, right, Willie?
Yeah, we should have, well, we wanted it. We were going to lose our lands in perpetuity, so we wanted it in perpetuity. But we also, you know, one of the original way that revenue sharing came about was the idea of revenue sharing for outer continental shelf sale. This is something that Stuart Udall came up with to try to minimize the impact on the federal budget, right? But as somebody was saying, Byron, the reality is that there are two things that made the settlement possible. Number one, Alaska was so fucking big. 375 million acres, right? There was land for everybody, right? And so that's one thing. The other was Prudhoe Bay. Money greases a lot in this society, you know. And so, and if you want to know, I mean, part of the reason we ended up with corporations, in a sense, was, and a lot of the tribal advocates kind of don't quite seem to grasp this. First of all, there was no assurance we were going to get anything, you know, for any lands whatsoever for the tribes to have under any, you know, scenario. But I'm having a Byron moment now.
You're talking about influence.
Yeah. The point I was trying to make is the point I was trying to make is that
You're going to have to become one of those libertarians running for Congress.
Yeah, now you're messing up my train. Now you're ruining my train of thought. If we had started the debate with the state on the question of tribal powers versus state powers, we'd have lost our land before we got that one resolved, right? I mean, that gets us, you know, like I said earlier, if the state wasn't on board, there wasn't going to be a settlement. And so why pick the most controversial thing? Because non-native Alaskans have always been paranoid about our villages. They had to have them in control from Juneau or wherever, you know, way out 2, 3, 4, 5, 1,000 miles away. They wanted to make sure they were under control, right? And like dumb shits, we let them do it, you know? And the missionaries played a hand in that. They taught us to respect authority, you know? Our people should have used their own minds, you know, and if you exercise the sovereignty, then you have it, right? So in part, that's going the corporate way was a less controversial way to get at what we really wanted, which was the land. Right?
Well, the window was passing too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Congress was going to see that pipeline built no matter what.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, you know, everybody was feeling more and more urgency to move as time went by, especially us, because we knew we could go into the Court of Claims on this, and that would be a really unmitigated disaster for us.
Other questions? Go ahead.
Okay. What is the current role that you see Alaska Native corporations playing today? What do you think are the most important roles from your perspectives?
First of all, they need to be successful because, in my view, their most important role is to bring value to shareholders. The dividends that come from these corporations, the jobs that come from these corporations, the local buying that occurs because of these corporations, all create jobs and livelihoods for mainly shareholders in the area. The corporations also bring back into the state monies that normally would flow the other way. People like Arco, not Arco, but ConocoPhillips and Exxon, they're siphoning money out of the state, sending it to their shareholders. We have workers, we have businesses outside the state where the profits are brought back to the state and distributed to the shareholders as dividends. And so that's a very important role. It provides monetary value to shareholders. The corporations also provide, to some major degree, supervision over the nonprofits. I know Siri does. They appoint most of the boards on the nonprofits and make sure that the services that they're organized for are actually being provided, like the housing, like Siri has organized and contributed about $50 million to its education foundation. And that foundation distributes educational scholarships to the shareholders and their descendants. Also, you've got Cook Inlet Tribal Council, and you've got South Central that provides health care services. And that is because Cook Inlet is considered a tribe for purposes of Indian money for contracts under the Indian Self-Determination Act. And so it's woven into this whole material of providing not only wealth services but social services to shareholders. And can the shareholders, can the regions do as well without the regional corporations? Perhaps, but you've got to figure out how that is to happen. Would a central tribe in the region take over that? That's possible if the shareholders vote to allow that to happen. So there are things that can happen. Will you be better off as a centralized tribe in the region? I don't know. You know, that has to be thought through. Right now, the status quo is, I think, is as good as we can hope for right now. It doesn't mean to say that you can do things to improve things. Quite the contrary. Improve on this over time. It's like E-Tuck says, you got a toolbox. So, to me, that's the main role of the regional corporation. You've got village corporations as well that play a similar, smaller role. Some of them run health clinics now. Some of the tribes run other kinds of services, housing services, and so forth.
How about political role?
Political, yeah, there's a political benefit. You know, as much as we hate to say it, money talks, you know, and BS walks. But money does talk, and you may, unless the law is changed, corporations can contribute to political campaigns and outcomes, and are recognized as such by the politicians and the businesses. So that's an important role that the corporations have been playing. Just to think that they have money and could spend it is a major political influence on politicians who want to do bad things to regional corporations, you know. So it's a defense that way.
What do you think, Willie?
I agree. No, actually, I think it's a very good question. One of the beauties of this settlement is that it allows each region or cultural group to kind of chart its own course. You know, and Roy had, I think, a simpler job in some ways, and it was a challenge, but the reality was that he could operate more like a corporation without, you know, in our instance, we are still, I think, affected very much by our cultural values and ways of going about doing things.
Tied to the subsistence.
Yeah, and
economy.
in fact, I used to kind of envy you in a sense that, because in our experience up north, in a way, I kind of like to think of it as the corporation at the time being what the tribe might have been in terms of its leadership, because we had some of our best people, you know, on our board, even though their charge was to run a profitable corporation. But the reality was that we didn't limit our role, and I don't think the people anticipated limits to the way we tried to work. So we took it for granted that we had to be profitable, and we were from the get-go. But we had humongous challenges. We decided to, after lots of discussion, we merged 10 villages into Nana. And we did it in Inupiaq, because we realized that we didn't have the management or the business opportunity in the villages at the time, and our share of the capital of that $1 billion was relatively small, and so we followed the SEC rules, and we merged, you know, and created sort of like a corporate tribe, so to speak, right? Except for the village of Kotzebue, which felt it was large enough to survive. And so we started out functioning like a business entity, you know, trying to figure out what to invest in, how to invest, et cetera. I eventually became president, but I was also the first shareholder president of the development corporation, so I spent a lot of time in the energy business and in banking and other things. But we began to feel that we weren't, there was sort of a void there from a cultural standpoint. And we began to feel, I particularly felt that we were sort of helping to dig our own cultural grave because we were so diligently focused on business and politics. Because it took politics to get, you know, the settlement. And we always understood the necessity of having influence for our people, because we understood the role of state government and federal government in the improvement of our material well-being, right? Because we had no schools, we had no safe water, we had no electricity, we had no housing, poor housing. So we always understood the necessity for continuing, keeping a finger on the political side of things. That took a lot of energy. You know, in fact, at one time I said I was both president of Nana and a state senator. Other regions wouldn't do that. But at the same time, we didn't limit ourselves to the corporation either, or just to politics. We also became the spearhead for cultural rejuvenation through what we call Inupiaq de l'Étoile, through our spirit program, which was almost it was a complete focus of all of our top management and board for a period of time, trying to do all we can to let our people know it's okay to be Inupiaq, in that our values were still relevant as they were 1,000 or 5,000 years ago. Those values made us who we were, in that it was up to the corporation to imbue those values into our corporate setup, and that the corporation was not an end but a means. It's a tool, right? Don't get confused by it. It's not about, I mean, sure, it's about having skills and talent, but the goal was the survival of our people, right, as a special part of the human race. You know, so our perspective didn't just limit ourselves to meeting the bottom line. And that's not to say that all the management has felt the same way. You know, but what we built an entire program based on inuperilot Koseda that involved politics, among other things. But the way we looked at it is all of those entities, whether it's Manila, the nonprofit, whether it was a school district, whether it was a corporation, they should be guided by the values that are held dear by our people, right? And so that's how we kind of looked at it, because it makes work more pleasant, because you're working for something greater than your
Just
2-week paycheck and your bonuses, right? That's not about what it is. I mean, you have the chance to do all of that as a youngster, but also to maintain your tribal spirit.
Roy, there was a point here in this region with so many different cultures that you chose to focus on things like justice and communications. And how did you come to those kinds of choices?
Well, I think I've mentioned this before, but I have always taken Etuck's view that the Settlement Act provided a vehicle that could be as diverse as we wanted it to be. Willie's right, you know. You don't have to be a corporate citizen per se. You be who you are, and your corporation is just one of your tools. And so we used that tool to reach out and do things that we might have done as a tribe. Provide health services, provide social services, provide housing services, provide health services, and so forth. And so we decided to form these nonprofit organizations, which I mentioned earlier, and that's all we had with the nonprofit model. That's all we could have. So we did it, and again, as Willie says, the job was to create a better society for our people, our shareholders, and the people that were not shareholders who were Native people as well. And so that's what we set out to do. Profits were important because they could finance the effort. They could finance a lot of the effort, and did finance a lot of the effort. So that's why we set out the way we did, and I noticed almost all of the other corporations did that. To one degree or another, they did that, and they acted as though they were a tribe providing all of these social services to their shareholders and to their tribal members. Mm-hmm. After all, they were tribal members that were called shareholders by Congress, you know. And so that's what we needed to do, and we set out to do that, and did do it, I think, to a very large extent.
I think Roy and them did some wonderful things here, not just for their own people, but for urban natives who have filtered in from all over Alaska. And oddly enough, we didn't want the Congress and the system to turn our settlement into this giant sieve where all the land and money came in, and then over time it dissipated into the society at large, right? That's what some of the Chamber of Commerce types hoped would happen, yeah. And of course that's what happened with the Allotment Act when the Indians lost almost 100 million acres between 1887 and 1934. Where they took commonly owned Indian lands and privatized them, supposedly for the benefit of the Indians, but it was really for the benefit of the non-natives. who were looking for land, cheap land, and they couldn't sell it for 20 years. After 20 years was up, boom, it was gone.
The most
You know?
dangerous piece of the act was 1991. The mandate by Congress that all restrictions come off all stock in 1991. We saw that as the most dangerous provision of the Settlement Act and set out to change it. It was a battle, but we did change it. Now you have to have a 50% vote plus one vote in order for anybody to sell shares. It's the way the settlement's written now. But that was a dangerous provision. It would do just what Willie said would
Exactly. Well,
happen.
that was part of the historical continuity, to make the Indians just an ordinary American, you know. In fact, that's why a lot of tribes were a little leery of our settlement, because it did remind them of the termination era under Eisenhower, when Eisenhower did in fact terminate
Several tribes.
some tribes, and when they looked at ours, they saw that it wasn't trust land, and they were shareholders as opposed to tribal members. That kind of disturbed the Indians a bit.
Anyway, right now, I think things are pretty safeguarded, and like I say, there's always room for improvement. And I think shareholders, if you measure where they were before the Settlement Act passed and where they are now, I think generally there is an increase in wealth, an increase maybe in opportunity, especially educational and other opportunities. So things are happening that are good, I think. We're not regressing. Sure, we have lots of poor people. We've always been the poorest of the poor if you measure it in the way the Department of Labor measures it. But we're moving along. We have our culture, and we have our subsistence. We have the way of life that we've been used to living if we lived in a village, and they're still living in a village. We still have that to fall back on. If the society in general collapses over money and economic reasons, the villages will still be around, because those people they can go out and get their meat and fish and water right there, and they can get their gardens going, and they have their cabins and no mortgages on them, and you know they can live, and the others will be in mayhem. And so it's not such a bad way to have your foot in that part of the equation as well, in the rural tribal equation.
So what was that Mao Zedong initiative back in?
Moved everybody to the rural part of the
Yeah,
country.
what was it, the
Make
culture,
farmers
something
out.
cultural revolution? Yeah. Well, in a sense, I mean, you know, we need to make sure that our corporate types aren't just these elites up here, right?
Well,
You know, that maybe they ought to be obligated to spend a certain amount of time in their own communities to really continue the connection, because you can get a pretty big head, you know, floating around the corporate world, and if we start having situations where the corporation is fighting against village interests, that to me is a problem.
the darn Brooks Brothers natives.
That's right, and a case in point was that, well, what was that law? Not the Outer Continental Shelf, but the coastal zone planning a few years ago. I mean, we built Red Dog when coastal zone was in full effect, and yet, when Reggie, and I think that was my daughter Liz's first staff role, was to staff the issue of the renewal of the coastal zone management in Alaska, and it failed in part because corporations swallowed the notion that they were being told by the oil industry and other mining types that it was a bad thing for business. Well, like I said, we did Red Dog when it was in full effect, and it gave the communities a chance not to kill something, but to talk about the problems that concern them. You know, and so if you get a disconnection between the corporate management and our people out there, that's a problem.
Another oddity about the Settlement Act is that it, as Willie said, there's 375 million acres in Alaska of land. 103 belong to the state now. And a piece inserted into the act was the D2 provision, which would put 80 million acres into federal classifications, wildlife, parks, etc. And that was a compromise. The environmentalists were ready to go full steam ahead to kill the Settlement Act unless they had this provision in there. And Congress hated it. They didn't want any more conservation land. They wanted to just get the settlement done. But these guys were loading it down with a huge provision like that. And so that was another compromise in the settlement, Section D2. Look at that in your books. That's what it did. It created the withdrawals that are now existent in several of the regions. In fact, they expanded it to, I think, 120 million acres of withdrawals for conservation. How do we feel about it? At first, we didn't like it, but now I think we feel okay about it because we have subsistence rights on those lands, and those lands are locked up forever in federal ownership. And they're not going to go into the private sector or to the state where they would be open to, local regulations that often are political. And so it's probably a good deal for us, if you think about it. I think we haven't been on it long enough to know how good a deal, but I think history will conclude that it was a good deal for us.
I love to chide the remnants of the chambers of commerce that we used to battle with. I tell them that, if you had real leadership at that point in time, they should have backed us for 100 million acres.
Yeah.
It's all locked up now. Can't help you, and it can't help us.
Yeah.
Anyway, just like to turn the knife a little.
As Willie said, Elmer Rasmussen was a different kind of a businessman. He is the only businessman, other than Barney Gottstein, that supported the Claim Settlement Act. Elmer put his money where his mouth was and provided a $250,000 loan for the AFN to use to bankroll the lobbying effort.
Of course, it was guaranteed by these guys.
Yeah.
He wasn't going to lose any money. He was going to get it out of the Clinkets high.
I know, but Dan and the boys, Dan Cuddy and the boys would not loan us a dime.
Yeah, that's right.
Remember that.
Yeah.
And of course, the Tyonek Corporation, the Tyonek Reservation, had found some oil on their land, and they had some money, so they loaned AFN $250,000 and got paid back.
And then the Yakimas.
And the Yakimas did too. So
That was a big risk.
that was a big risk.
They were charging big interest,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, they could have lost it all.
They could.
Anyway.
So there were some good people involved on the outside that helped us.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for spending your morning with us. This is really an honor. We're honored to have you here, and what you've shared is something we just wouldn't have heard anywhere else. So,
Well,
thank you for
that was a story between 8 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon. Now, the best stories are after 5.
Anyway, here's a little funny little note for you to end with. Alaska's pretty diversified in terms of our culture. We're standard American. We're Heinz 57. We're everything. My culture, my background is several different, German and Russian and Yupik. But anyway, at the time Syria was going through its agony in getting its land settlement renegotiated with the federal government, there were 3 guys that were testing their hand at it. That was George Miller, who was then president of Syria, Alex Shadura, who was of Russian descent, an old-timer there, and let's see, who was the other one? It was Otto Thiel. Anyway, they went back to negotiate, and the Department of Interior handed them their proposal, and they looked at it, and the department said, the guy said, do you want to go in another room so you can debate it? And George said, no. He said, we'll debate it right here. And they said, what? You're going to debate it in front of us? And George said, yeah. And so they proceeded, they broke out in Russian, and they were talking. I thought that was so funny. They were talking in Russian.
Roy, you can't leave the room without a joke. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.